3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
Three, two, one.
Here we go!
Well, hey everybody, back in January we started in this famous teaching of Jesus called the Sermon on the Mount. And let me just start today by saying that if you have not watched the message, let me strongly encourage you to do so. I can't fully cover everything here that I did there, and actually I didn't even have time to cover everything about this subject during that message. Every week it's been a challenge to come to the teachings of Jesus, and all I want to ask us to do today, as I would every week, is to just ask us to at least maybe just think about and maybe take some steps towards living this life that Jesus has laid out for us. Could you maybe believe that even if you don't understand it or agree with it, that it might actually lead to a better life? So maybe we can ask ourselves this. Could I be willing to let go of everything that I think is right and what I want to be true and what I believe if Jesus says it could actually lead to something different and better? Now, we jumped into this mini-series a couple of weeks ago asking this question, who is a good person? And it's a question people had been asking, and we ask as well. Jesus says it actually takes righteousness, which is the key to the whole thing. And we learned this Greek word, dikaiosune, which means what it is that makes a person truly right or good. And Jesus, speaking to a culture that believed you were a good person if you just did the right thing at the right time and followed the rules, and that's great, but they neglected the bigger issues of the heart. That there's a righteousness of the heart that deals with who you are and who you're becoming, as opposed to a righteousness of behavior that only deals with what you do and what people see. And it was Jesus who was saying, I can put my righteousness in you through faith. And then Jesus gives 6 real-life examples when he contrasts the old way of doing things, when he says, you have heard that it was said. And then he lays it alongside the new way of doing things when he says, but I tell you, that there's a kingdom way of being good from the heart. And then we come to this section in Matthew chapter 5, verse 31, where Jesus says, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a written notice of divorce. But I tell you, whoever divorces his wife, except in a case of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now there's a whole lot going on in there, but just understand that Jesus lived in a world where there were several different schools of thought about divorce. And much of what was happening had morphed into a very permissive kind of a culture. For example, people believed that if she's not a very good cook, you could just throw her out. If the husband saw a woman who was better looking and he wanted to take a run at that relationship, he should just go ahead. You didn't even need a good reason. You just had to do it the right way. He just needed to provide her a legal document called a get, dissolving the marriage and giving her permission to remarry. All you had to do was give them the paper, and everyone was free to move on. But we have to understand what a woman's options were in that culture when she's no longer married. And you have to understand then why God never intended it to be this way. See, a divorced woman had basically 3 options. One, she could find a relative to take her in, and they would most likely put her to work as a servant. So she might get a little air mattress over in the corner with her family, but they would likely hold that grudge against her. Second option was to find another man who would marry her, and he would be there to remind her every single day that she was damaged goods. Some of us know that from our own experience. We've been treated that kind of a way before. Or a third option, in a culture that doesn't have room for you to make a decent life as a single woman without rights, with no kids, possibly no career path. It's a difficult life. She'd likely choose prostitution, thinking, well, at least I get paid. So you think all of her options, right? They're all bad. Execution, which was the punishment for adultery, slavery, or prostitution. You think about this situation: to maybe not marry again, to grow old with no children to care for you, to have no social position or rights, to have this perpetual failure following you everywhere. You can better understand how it was easy to end up living in a degraded sexual relationship with a husband or maybe even a boyfriend who probably never let her forget it. Which is partly why Jesus says, you have forced her into adultery. She has no other options. But a man under this arrangement was off the hook. And he thought he was righteous because when he was done with her, he gave her a document that declared her free. He can tell himself he was a good person because he followed the letter of the law. Hey, I gave her the paper, she can move on. But he knows, and Jesus knows, he's not giving her very good options. And Jesus, speaking into and doing battle in a culture in which divorce had become permissive, says essentially, hey, we've got a messed up system when it comes to marriage and divorce. That's ruining lives. You guys think you're good because you did the paperwork, but your reasons are shallow, causing damage because you ignored your heart. So don't miss the bigger questions here. What's going on in a person's heart to lead them to do what they're doing in the way that they're doing it? What's happening in a person's heart that would have them treat someone this way? If you jump over to Matthew chapter 19, Jesus is asked a question, same question most of us have. Essentially, what is the rule about divorce that would allow us to still call ourselves a good Christian? And here's what I want you to notice in Matthew chapter 19 and verse 4. Jesus answers their question about divorce by talking about marriage. I think the reason we don't understand divorce very well is because we don't understand marriage very well. Jesus doesn't look at culture for a current definition. He goes back to the original design when he says the Creator, right? The Creator made people male and female. One man and one woman. You'll read the Hebrew words, one ish and one isha, a masculine and a feminine noun, joined together. That's where we get our word for integrity. There's unity, there's oneness by a spiritual bond. We read throughout the scriptures that relationship is an earthly portrayal of a spiritual thing, meaning your marriage is a picture of the Trinity coming together. Like a man, a woman bound together by God, loving, serving, submitting, laying down rights for each other. And if we could grasp that understanding of marriage, then we would better understand why Jesus says, therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. And when Jesus gives this answer, nobody argues with him. They just ask a follow-up question, which is this. So why is divorce allowed in certain situations? And Jesus tells them, well, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because of the hardness of your hearts, because you're stubborn and don't agree with God. But, and again he refers back, it was not like that from the beginning. So what causes a person's heart to become hard? Maybe that's the bigger question. You know, Jesus just laid out a lot of it earlier in this teaching. We looked at this in recent weeks. Anger, he says, which leads to frustration and contempt, where we can redefine people, maybe even redefine our marriage. Things that are below the surface, years in the process that might lead us to then look in bad places to meet expectations. Which means, if I could just simplify it for us, divorce might not be the biggest problem going for some of us. Yeah, it's bad. It hurts. But having a hard heart may actually be the bigger problem. Because how many damaged relationships could be traced back to these things? It's really the result of something that happened way back there. It seems God makes allowance for divorce in certain situations because we're humans. I mean, we're messed up, struggling, we hurt each other, and sometimes we bury the other person without giving them an escape. But I will say this, just to be clear. I don't think divorce is your best option. A changed heart is really the only solution. And this should be our prayer. And I'm speaking about myself, I want God's goodness to live deep inside of me. I want to have a transformed life. I need to have a transformed heart. So God, would you help me to look at me? So let me say it in hopefully a little bit more encouraging way. That whatever you start to value and practice and move towards today is what will show up in your future. So what are some changes I might need to make in my life to have the future that I want to have? Could you form a vision for the kind of marriage that Jesus talks about? Because whatever you decide to do from now on will show up in the future. So start asking yourself some bigger questions. Like, what do I want my kids to experience? Like, what do I want my future spouse to experience? When Jesus is king of our hearts, we can find these ways to bear with one another, to speak the truth to one another, to live in love together because Jesus is living inside of us. He's changing us so that two lives can continue to live as one. And that can be a reality for anyone in any situation when Jesus is king of your heart.